All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon or morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Developing the Passport Learning Outcomes and Proficiency Criteria for Human Society and the Individual. I'm Kate Springsteen, Member Services Coordinator for Interstate Passport. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available at www.wichi.edu/passport/webinars by tomorrow, June 30th. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please type your question into the box on the GoToWebinar panel and it will be brought to the presenter's attention. Following the webinar, I will send out an email with information on where to find the recording of this webinar, as well as a link to a survey which we would very much appreciate if you'd fill out. I'm delighted to introduce you to our presenter for today's webinar, Jonathan Carrier. Jonathan is the faculty chair and a full-time psychology instructor at the Albany County campus of Laramie County Community College. He supervises, mentors, and trains adjunct faculty in pedagogy, assessment, curriculum design and development, and best practices in classroom management. Previously, he was the assistant director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Laramie County Community College and has also been a mental health and rehabilitation counselor. Jonathan holds a BS in Psychology and Sociology from East Tennessee State University, a dual MS in Community Mental Health Counseling and Rehabilitation Counseling from Portland State University, and a PhD in Leadership with a specialization in Psychology from the University of the Cumberlands. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hi, thanks so much, Kate. Hi, everyone. As Kate said, I'm Jonathan Carrier, and I was the Human Society and the Individual Chair. And today I'm going to talk about developing the passport learning outcomes and proficiency criteria for human society and the individual. So I wanted to start with just going over an outline of what we're going to cover today. First, we'll talk about an overview of the Interstate Passport. What is it, what its purpose is, and its key components. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time talking about developing the passport learning outcomes and proficiency criteria for the human society and the individual area. We'll talk about the task we were given. We'll talk about writing the PLOs and PCs. We'll talk about the timeline we followed, and then I'll do a deeper dive into the learning outcomes and proficiency criteria to measure those outcomes. And then finally, we'll close with how and why you might want to become a member of the Interstate Passport. So what is Interstate Passport? Interstate Passport is a new program to advance friction-free student transfer. It's a grassroots initiative originated by academic leaders in the Western states. It focuses on lower division general education courses, and which creates a block transfer based on learning outcomes and proficiency criteria developed by multi-state faculty negotiation. Essentially, the idea behind the Passport project is that students complete a block of general education credits that they can then transfer between Interstate Passport institutions seamlessly. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then, of course, Interstate Passport tracks student academic progress through registrars and institutional researchers. And overall, the Interstate Passport focuses on ensuring quality and streamlining pathways for students to graduate. Overall, like I mentioned, the Interstate Passport wants to reduce unnecessary repetition of academic work after students transfer. As we know that when students transfer between institutions, it is often the case that they lose some of their general education credits because the new institution won't accept them. This makes students spend more money, makes students spend more time retaking classes that they've already taken. And then ultimately, some students do not complete because of this, and we don't want that to happen. So the Interstate Passport is very important in helping students to get through by not having to repeat general education classes when they transfer. Right here I have the 6 major components of Interstate Passport. The 2 components I'm going to talk about today are the passport learning outcomes and human society and the individual. And then we'll talk about the proficiency criteria in human society and the individual. So just as a broad overview, just so you know, the Interstate Passport is comprised of 9 general education areas that were developed from PLOs, that is the Association of American Colleges and Universities, Liberal Education in America's Promised Essential Learning Outcomes, and then also pairing that with WICHE research. So first we have foundational skills. These are skills that students will need to be successful in just about any coursework they take at the college level. That's oral communication, written communication, and quantitative literacy. And then we get into knowledge of concepts. These are theories and concepts that you'll find within specific classes. So creative expression, natural sciences, human cultures, and then the area we'll talk about today, human society and the individual. And then finally, the general education block is completed with cross-cutting skills, and that is critical thinking and teamwork and value systems. And these cross-cutting skills are areas that would be useful in any course that they take in their academic career. So let's start off by defining what the human society and the individual area is. We defined it as human society and the individual explores human behavior in social settings through scientific inquiry within the context of value systems, institutions, economic structures, social groups, and or environments. The relationship to your institution's passport block would be disciplines such as sociology, geography, history, criminology, psychology, economics, and probably many others. Essentially, we're looking at the social sciences here that have a scientific foundation in qualitative and quantitative analysis. But you can make the case that many social sciences not listed here could fit into this passport block. We'll talk about the tasks that we were given as a group. We were tasked with developing the passport learning outcomes to explain what a student should know and or be able to do with regard to human society and the individual. And then we were tasked with developing proficiency criteria to offer suggestions on how students demonstrate proficiency in the area of human society and the individual. So essentially, the passport learning outcomes are what a student should know and be able to do within this area. And the proficiency criteria are examples of how they might demonstrate that knowledge and that ability. So I wanted to talk now a little bit about our team. Our team in human society and the individual was comprised of 12 faculty members representing institutions in 7 states. We had faculty members from North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, Oregon, California, and Hawaii. Here are the names of the faculty members that were involved in this project. As you can see, we had quite a few of the social sciences represented. We had sociology, psychology, all the way to geography, history, and even economics. We felt that that was a nice sampling of the social sciences to be able to effectively tackle this area. So I wanted to talk now a little bit about our timeline and our overall process of writing the passport learning outcomes and proficiency criteria. It all started with universities within the home states of the team members. So each faculty member that was a member of the human society and the individual team started at their home institutions, and they met with faculty at their home institutions to develop what they felt like would be good learning outcomes within human society and the individual. Once that had been completed, those team members left their home institutions and traveled to Boulder, Colorado in November of 2015. And all of the individual state reps then examined the passport learning outcomes that were developed at the home institutions, and we really worked to boil those down to what you will see here in just a minute. So we really started with faculty input from all the home institutions, and many faculty were involved in that. And then those state reps met in Boulder to hone those down to what you will see here in just a few minutes. After we met in November, we went back to our home institutions. Once again, we took what we had developed and adapted into our passport learning outcomes for human society and the individual. We took them back to our home faculty. At that point, our home faculty either recommended changes or said, no, this looks good. And then in December 2015, we met on a couple of conference calls to finalize those passport learning outcomes for human society and the individual. At that point, we made an agreement as a team that the PLOs would stay the way they were. We would not change them when we reconvened in February to work on the proficiency criteria. And that really helped us move the process forward. So then the process started again in January of 2016. Faculty at the home institutions met as groups to recommend proficiency criteria, ways that it could be demonstrated through assignments that students were meeting the passport learning outcomes we had already developed. And then once that was done at the home institutions, state reps then again traveled to Boulder, but in February 2016 this time, and we followed the same process as we did with the learning outcomes. We looked at what the home state faculty groups had recommended. We took those, we adapted many of them, we kept many of them, and then we developed a few of our own. After that process was completed, again, we mirrored the process that we followed with the PLOs. The team members went back to their home institutions, met with their home faculty, and the home faculty recommended changes or gave their blessing on what we had come up with. And then we did another few conference calls to finalize the proficiency criteria, and then we were completed with the process. So at this point, I wanted to do a deeper dive and talk about the PLOs and proficiency criteria that we came up with for human society and the individual. We felt like we were tasked with something almost monumental at first. Human society and the individual covers such a broad array of coursework. It covers such a broad array of areas that you might cover within that coursework. And so we started with trying to develop the passport learning outcomes, and we kind of got stuck at first. Well, how many passport learning outcomes should there be? And we had this huge list, and it was becoming oh my goodness, how can we possibly get all this done? And then someone had the bright idea of, wait a minute, let's organize these into features. And then once we organize them into the features of core knowledge, basics of scientific inquiry, analytical applications, information use and communication, and social responsibility, we were then able to basically organize the passport learning outcomes by feature, and then we really moved quickly after that. So let's start with the feature of core knowledge and talk about the passport learning outcomes and then the proficiency criteria for the first area of core knowledge. So the first passport learning outcome was define vocabulary, concepts, and terminology in the social sciences and identify theories. And we felt like this is a really good passport learning outcome for human society and the individual because every area, whether you teach sociology, geography, criminal justice, psychology, they're all going to have their own unique vocabulary, concepts, and terminology. And so we felt like that's something that you would expect any student to be able to demonstrate regardless of the class within the social sciences. Some examples we came up with some example assignments we developed to show that students might be able to show proficiency in that learning outcome were for example, in a paper, students define society, culture, deviance, and inequality. Or perhaps in an online discussion post, students differentiate between operant and classical conditioning. Students might also define blue-collar and white-collar crime in a minute paper. So we felt like any area, any course within human society and individuals is going to have assignments or mechanisms to show that students are able to define vocabulary, concepts, and terminology in those fields. And it's important to bring up that the passport transfer level proficiency criteria we have there, these are just examples of how students would be able to demonstrate proficiency in a particular learning outcome. These are not proficiency criteria you would have to be using or adapt for use at your institution. If you like them, you certainly could use them. But I'm certain that every instructor or professor at your institution has a way to demonstrate. The proficiency criteria are just examples of how you might demonstrate proficiency in a learning outcome. Our second learning outcome under core knowledge is explain the role of individuals and institutions within the context of society. We came up with several examples, several proficiency criteria of how this might demonstrate proficiency in an assignment. Students might write a paper describing the contributions of farmers and those who use their farm products to the benefit of society. Students might also use a think, pair, share and explain the role of the police within the context of the U.S. justice system. Again, many ways to show proficiency within these learning outcomes. Once we had that feature satisfied, we moved on to develop the feature of basics of scientific inquiry. we developed 2 passport learning outcomes for basics of scientific inquiry. And I'll bring this up a little bit later when we talk about rewards and challenges of the process. I will say now, though, that this area was one that we spent a lot of time on and we had a lot of discussion about. It turned out that we all didn't agree what basics of scientific inquiry were, what they are. And some instructors in some social science fields were having students do complete research projects, from developing a research question, collecting data, writing a full research report, including statistical analyses, while others were just having students do journal article reviews or giving students data sets to work from. So we really had to hone down what basics of scientific inquiry really mean, and I think we did a good job with that. So the first learning outcome that came out of basics of scientific inquiry was explain and apply theories to social phenomena and human activity. Some examples we came up for that: students might write a paper in which they appropriately apply a social science theory to a social issue within one of the following areas: crime, poverty, gender inequality, race and ethnic relationships, or problems within family, education, or the economy. Students might also, in a short answer exam question, apply the theory of comparative advantage to the division of labor in a household. Students might, for example, in a peer-reviewed debate, provide 3 modern examples of Schumpeter's creative destruction theory. Again, depending on the course, there are many ways for a student to demonstrate proficiency in that learning outcome. The second learning outcome was, under basics of scientific inquiry, was evaluate various types and forms of research, including their ethical considerations. I feel like we came up with some great example assignments to demonstrate proficiency in that learning outcome. One might be, in a short answer exam question, students evaluate cross-sectional and longitudinal research designs. Another might be, in an essay or class discussion, students analyze ethics of famous and/or historical research studies. For example, Zimbardo's prison study and Milgram's obedience study, highlighting the role of the social setting and the presence of an authority figure in shaping behavior. We also had the example of, in a class discussion, students evaluate the merits and limitations of observational, correlational, survey, and experimental research designs. We felt, again, those were good examples of proficiency criteria for the second learning outcome under basics of scientific inquiry. We then moved on to develop the feature of analytical applications. The first learning outcome under analytical applications is identify, frame, and/or respond to a research question. An example assignment for that might be, in a 2-page paper using a given data set, students formulate a research question, problem, or issue, and provide the background information to support an argument on a social phenomenon or human activity relevant to the discipline. Students might also write a research question to investigate gun control in America. Again, many proficiency criteria could be developed to show proficiency in that learning outcome. Our second learning outcome under analytical applications was compile, interpret, analyze, and/or evaluate qualitative and/or quantitative data. Some example assignments we came up with for proficiency criteria for that second learning outcome are: students might conduct a content analysis and write a report on gender roles and stereotypes in popular 3rd or 4th grade books. Students might also conduct and present a poverty line threshold analysis by compiling information from reliable sources, calculating living expenses, and contrasting that to income earned, such as minimum wage or living wage. Students might also compile basic demographic data from 2 different regions and then discuss the similarities and differences in a short essay. We then moved on to develop the feature of information use and communications. We felt that regardless of the social science area and human society and the individual area, you're going to be able to need to use information and communicate that information to others. So the first learning outcome we came up with for that was interpret and communicate various representations of qualitative and/or quantitative data. Example assignments for proficiency criteria could be, on an exam, students are given statistical results to interpret, for example, a correlation coefficient or test of statistical significance. Students might also use the Fred database at the St. Louis Fed Students might find data based on that on the daily exchange rate between the US dollar and the euro over the last 12 months. Students might then input the data into a worksheet and explain how the changes affected producers and consumers in the US and Europe. The second learning outcome under information use and communications was responsibly identify, categorize, evaluate, and cite multiple sources. Example proficiency criteria, example assignments that could demonstrate proficiency might be students might use a proper citation style such as the APA, MLA, ASA, or Chicago in a literature review assignment. Students might also create an annotated bibliography using required citation style. And then finally, we developed our largest feature, social responsibility, that had 3 learning outcomes. The first of which was recognize the complexities of diverse social identities. An example assignment for that might be as a class assignment, students might create mind maps of themselves as individuals, family members, community members, and members of a greater social world. They will then explain to other students how those different selves are interconnected. The second learning outcome under social responsibility is evaluate issues of social justice with regard to identities within diverse contexts. An example transfer level proficiency criteria for that might be, after watching a film, students identify examples of institutional injustice represented by using a student response system and then participate in a class discussion based on that. Then our final learning outcome under social responsibility was apply knowledge and experience critically so as to realize an informed sense of self, family, community, and the diverse social world in which we live. An example proficiency criteria that could show proficiency in that learning outcome might be, in a service learning project, students provide 10 hours of community service and reflect and journal on individual actions and their consequences on others and society at large. Again, we were very pleased with the PLOs and proficiency criteria we came up for human society and the individual. We felt like those passport learning outcomes could apply to just about any social science, and many of those transfer level proficiency criteria examples could be applied to demonstrate proficiency in those learning outcomes. I want to talk a little bit about the challenges and rewards of being a team member and playing a role as the chair in the human society and the individual team. It was just a wonderfully collegial group. All the team members are very student focused. What I mean by that is, what should students know in this area, and what type of assignments should students be able to use to show mastery and proficiency in this area. We were very focused on building those PLOs that accurately represented what students should know within human society and the individual, and then we were very careful to develop good examples, good example proficiency criteria that demonstrate proficiency in all of those learning outcomes, or each of those learning outcomes. There were no arguments, and I wouldn't even say there were any real challenges. It was just such a collegial group that we all shared the same goal of developing the best PLOs and PCs that we could for the area. But we did have some areas of greater discussion, and I alluded to a few of those earlier. Our big, right out of the gate on the first day, we spent a lot of time discussing how many learning outcomes should be present in human society and the individual. Again, the area spans such a wide array of social science classes that if we weren't careful, we could have tried to develop too many to be useful, but we didn't want to develop so few that we left any social science classes out. And again, we feel like we did a great job of developing exactly the right number of learning outcomes that covers just about any class that you would find within human society and the individual. And that went really well, and then we got to the basics of scientific inquiry feature, and we spent a lot of time discussing and working on that. As I had said before, people were all over the place in terms of what they viewed as basic. Some psychology instructors and professors were doing much more in the form of full studies, even at the sophomore level, and some folks were doing very basic terminology and very basic data stuff. And again, we feel like that we boiled that down to what we could all agree were basics of scientific inquiry for the learning outcomes, and then also proficiency criteria examples. And then finally, the overarching challenge that led to greater discussion throughout was developing proficiency criteria examples that covered the breadth of academic areas under human society and individuals. So we wanted to make sure we came up with proficiency criteria that you might find underneath sociology. You might also find, we had to develop criteria for psychology. We had to develop proficiency criteria examples for even economics and history. And that's why you see so many proficiency criteria. We really didn't want to leave anyone out and make sure folks who were looking at this saw their courses within human society and the individual represented in some example assignments for proficiency criteria to demonstrate proficiency in any given learning outcome. But overall, I have to say that being the chair and being a team member in human society and individual was just an incredibly rewarding process. I'm sad to say the process is over and the PLOs and the PCs are developed, but if ever those are revisited, I would jump at the chance to be a part of that team again. It's something I'll probably remember for the rest of my academic career. Just enjoyed working with other folks in the social sciences to try to help students. It was very rewarding. At this point, I'd like to take any questions from the audience if they have any questions about the process of developing the human society and the individual learning outcomes or proficiency criteria. And then after I take your questions on this, we'll move on and talk a little bit more about becoming a Passport member. So if you have any questions, please let me know.
Hi, Jonathan. This is Kate. It doesn't look like we have any questions right now, but if you guys do think of some questions, again, just type them into the questions box on the GoToWebinar panel, and Jonathan can take those at the end as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Kate. And it looks like we don't have any questions about the process, so let's move on and talk about how to become a Passport institution. First off, it starts with faculty. Faculty review Passport learning outcomes within those 9 general education areas, and they review them for congruence with the general education areas at your institution. The faculty then construct the institution's Passport block. These are the general education areas, the courses that satisfy the general education areas that then would transfer to any other participating Passport institution. At that point, the administrators at the institution apply for passport status and sign an MOA, a Memorandum of Agreement. Then the colleges or universities advisors and marketers inform and advise students about the Passport and why it's beneficial to them to participate. At that point, the registrars review students' transcripts and award the Passport based on the Passport block that the faculty had constructed for any particular institution. And then finally, the institution's institutional researchers would track the academic progress of Passport students. So let's talk about Interstate Passport Quality Assurance. First, in order for a class to be included in a Passport block, the student has to have completed that class with a minimum grade of C or better. Student progress after transferring is tracked through the National Student Clearinghouse. And then the Passport Review Board monitors Passport efficacy. And then there's an evaluation research study of Passport impact going on, and that is carried out by the Education and Employment Research Center at Rutgers University School of Management and Labor Relations. And then a pilot project is going on that is mapping assignments to Passport learning outcomes in Colorado, Montana, New Mexico, and in CHEMS. So why might you want to become a member of the Interstate Passport Network? First off, and perhaps most importantly, this facilitates transfer of students across state lines and within states. As I had mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, transfer between institutions and between institutions and other states is a major obstacle for student success. It is extremely common that a student may transfer from one state, from an institution in one state to an institution in another state, and the institution to which they're transferring refuses to accept some of their general education coursework. This costs the student time, this costs the student money, and this often leads to students not completing in a timely fashion or completing at all. And so we want to make sure that we eliminate that obstacle for students. The second issue here, the second benefit, is that it eliminates the necessity for review of lower division general education course changes and articulation agreements. It is often that articulation agreements change. Sometimes they change yearly, sometimes they change every few years. Having a block general education passport block stops the need for that. You just accept the block. No need for new articulation agreements in terms of lower division GE courses. Another benefit to becoming a member of the Interstate Passport Network is that we focus on the quality for positive impact. We focus on quality for positive impact and completion. This is based on what students should learn and the learning outcomes and be able to apply, as evidenced by the proficiency criteria. It generates data on academic success after transfer, and then it provides data for use in continuous self-improvement. And that's for me one of the most important things, is that we can now see at the institution that I'm at, Laramie County Community College, we can see if our students are being successful after they transfer. If they're not, we can take a hard look at that and see what we need to do to better teach those students, to better prepare those students. If they are doing very well, we can feel good about what we're doing, and we can further adapt that for greater improvement. And then finally, being a member of the Interstate Passport Network really keeps you adapting to higher education's changing landscape. The project embraces assessments determined by your department, your program, your institution. The proficiency criteria that I listed for the area of human society and the individual, these are just examples. It is extremely likely that the courses you teach that are within human society and the individual have similar assignments. You could use those assignments as your proficiency criteria to demonstrate learning outcomes. And then, of course, it allows for non-course-based educational experiences, which is becoming ever more popular in higher education. If you have further questions, you can please look at our website. The web address is here. And then you can also, if you have questions about the development of the human society and the individual area, you can give me an email. My email is listed there, and if you have greater questions about WICHE in general and the Passport Project in general, please contact Keith Springsteen. I see I have a question here. How do you objectively assess whether a student response is sufficient to show proficiency on questions as multifaceted as using given data on dollar-euro exchange rate variances? Explain how rate changes affected consumers in the U.S. and Europe, and who does the judging of the efficacy on the paper. So we would look at the learning outcome for that, and that is decided in terms of the faculty teaching in that area under the human society and individual. The faculty teaching in that would decide whether that sufficiently shows proficiency to be satisfying that learning outcome. And again, remember, we do that anyway. When we are teaching, we already have learning outcomes assigned to our classes. At my institution, we have what are called MCORs, Master Course Outlines of Record, and those list learning outcomes for each of the psychology courses I teach. My assignments are essentially my proficiency criteria. And so that's done by the faculty member and the faculty team at your institution. And again, that's a continuous process that you do at your institution in judging the efficacy of any work your students do. Does that sufficiently answer that question?
Jonathan, I think that was a good answer. And just to add to it, I think that it builds on the idea that Interstate Passport provides a lot of institutional autonomy, and that determining proficiency is left up to the faculty at each institution, and it's not determined by Interstate Passport staff. I would also add that courses that a student takes to get their learning outcomes crossed off of, they have to earn at least a C or better in those courses. There's a follow-up question to this, Jonathan, and the question is, so then the assessment is conducted and rated by the institution that is receiving the transfer student, say a department chair or subject expert?
Yeah, I don't see that question listed. Oh, is that here? Okay. So then the assessment is conducted and rated by the institution that is receiving the transfer student. No, the assessment is conducted and rated by the institution from which the student came to be a member of the passport block, to be included in the passport block. And again, that's what Kate said about the quality assurance starts at the institution. And then later on, if we find that students coming from a particular institution who are earning, the passport block for general education, but then they're not doing well after transfer, that's something that later on could be revisited between at WICHE and then between institutions. Is that more or less correct, Kate?
Yeah, that's correct. There's several quality assurance pieces. There's the minimum grade of a C or better, and then there's also the student data and tracking that goes through the National Student Clearinghouse. And like Jonathan said, if it's found that an institution is sending out students that are consistently underperforming, then that will be looked into in further detail. All right. I don't have any further questions in the questions box, but if you do have some, please send them forward, or else you can email either one of us, and we'd be happy to respond to those questions later on.
I'll just wait just for a minute, Kate, to see if any more questions come up before we wrap up.
Okay.
Are you seeing any more questions come across, Kate?
I do not have any further questions on here.
Okay, great. Well, everyone, that concludes the discussion about the development of the human society and the individual area. It's been a pleasure talking to you today, and I look forward to you emailing me any further questions you have about that area's development. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Kate.